After learning about the bones of skull, you should know that there are certain important landmarks in relation with the skull that has got clinical importance. Let us look into those important landmarks. Look at the picture wherein you can see the skull, and let us see the important landmarks. At the chin, you will see the projection that is known as the gnathion. It is a landmark. Then at the upper part of the bridge of the nose, the junction of the frontal bone with the nasal bones is the nasion. And in between the two superciliary arches will be the glabella, and the point of junction between the sagittal suture and coronal suture is the Bregma. Then the junction of the sagittal suture with the lambdoid suture is the lambda. The prominent point on the occipital bone, that is the external occipital protuberance, is the Inion, and along the lateral view, if you see the junction of the parietal, occipital, and then the squamous part is the asterion. Then if you see on the base of skull, the anterior and posterior margins of foramen magnum, wherein you will find the midpoints of the posterior margin of the foramen magnum as the opistheon, and the anterior margin midpoint as the basion. And if you see in the lateral view, there is a H-shaped sulcus separating the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and the sphenoid bones, that is the pterion. Now let us discuss in detail about each of these landmarks. The word gnathion is derived from the Greek, and it is the midpoint on the lower border of the mandible, which you can see, and it is a reference point used in craniometric and dental correctional procedures. So that is the importance of the gnathion. Nasion is the junction of nasal bones and frontal bone, which you can see here. This point is important in cosmetic surgery. For example, the rhinoplasty that deals with altering the shape of the nose. So the frontal and nasal bones and their intersecting point are important in craniometry. Glabella. It is the midpoint at the level of superciliary arches. These are the superciliary arches. At the midpoint between the two will be the glabella. It's an important landmark for the study of dental and skeletal relationships in cephalometry. The pineal gland is located 7 centimeters posterior to the glabella. Another importance of glabella is it is one of the sites for injecting the botulinum toxin in the treatment of migraine headaches, and also in cosmetic procedures. So to reduce the wrinkles of forehead, this is one of the site where the botulinum toxin is injected to reduce forehead wrinkles. So that is about the Bregma. Another important landmark is the pterion or Sylvian point. It's a region that shows H-shaped sulcus where four bones meet. The four bones that are meeting are the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the greater wing of sphenoid, and squamous part of temporal bone. You can see the two limbs of the H, the two vertical limbs, and joining them will be the transverse line you are seeing. So this encircled area is the pterion, and it is a fixed zone and the weakest part of the skull. And the surface marking for this is, it is about 4 centimeters above the midpoint of zygomatic arch and the same distance behind the zygomatic process of frontal bone. This is the zygomatic process of frontal bone. It's 4 centimeters behind it, and this is the zygomatic arch, and it is 4 centimeters above its midpoint. And it is the thinnest bone. The vital structure is there, and vital area of cerebrum is also there underneath it. So the structure that is lying underneath it is the anterior branch of middle meningeal artery, which is seen on the inner aspect of the skull at the region of the pterion. If there is a blow on the pterion, as is the case in boxers, it may rupture the artery and can cause bleeding, resulting in extradural hematoma. Another important point of pterion is it corresponds to the stem of lateral sulcus or Sylvian fissure of the brain. The central sulcus of the cerebrum, which starts at the superomedial border, or it cuts the superomedial border because it extends onto the medial surface also, and it comes down to a point which is 2.5 centimeters behind the pterion. So the inferior point of the central sulcus can be marked by taking a point 2.5 centimeters behind the pterion. So that is the importance of pterion. The other landmark is the Bregma. The word is derived from Greek, which means top of head, and it is at the junction of the coronal and sagittal suture. So this is the coronal suture and this is the sagittal suture. The Bregma is the place where the frontal and two parietal bones will meet, and this is the location of anterior fontanelle in the neonate, which closes around 18 months after birth. The congenital disorder known as cleidocranial dysostosis, the anterior fontanelle will not close to form the Bregma. Then the central sulcus of the cerebrum is 5 centimeters behind the Bregma. The upper point is 5 centimeters behind Bregma. The lower point is 2.5 centimeters behind the pterion. Then the precentral gyrus is 4.5 centimeters behind the Bregma, whereas the postcentral gyrus is 6.5 centimeters behind the Bregma. So the importance of the Bregma is the presence of the frontal fontanelle or the anterior fontanelle, the central sulcus apparent, the precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus. So the word lambda is derived from the Greek as it resembles the Greek letter lambda. This is the lambda. This is the junction of lambdoid suture and sagittal suture and the meeting point of the posterior ends of two parietal bones and the occipital bone. And it is the site of location of posterior fontanelle or occipital fontanelle in the neonate that closes around 6 months after birth. Then the calcarine sulcus of cerebrum. You can see here the calcarine sulcus of cerebrum, the occipital lobe, is 3 to 4 centimeters below the lambda. So it's a landmark for the calcarine sulcus. Coming to the another landmark, the Inion, which is the projecting part of occipital bone at the base of skull, and it is known as the external occipital protuberance. But actually Inion is tip of external occipital protuberance, and to this Inion will be attached the ligamentum nuchae and trapezius muscles. It's a landmark for EEG recording, that is electroencephalography recording, and it is an easily palpable landmark and the surface marking for the internal attachment of the tentorium cerebelli, and it is also one of the craniometric points used in radiology and anthropometry for skull measurements. The calcarine sulcus of cerebrum is 2 centimeters above the Inion. So these are the important clinical points for the landmark Inion. The other landmark is the asterion, which is derived from the Greek, which means story, and is at the posterior end of parieto mastoid suture. This is the parietal bone and this is the mastoid, and the suture is there, posterior end of parieto-mastoid suture, and this is the region where 3 bones meet, that is the occipital bone, the parietal bone and the temporal bone, and this is also the region where 3 sutures meet. This is the lambdoid suture, then the parieto-mastoid and occipito-mastoid sutures. This is a relatively mobile zone, and it is a landmark for neurosurgical approach to the posterior cranial fossa by neurosurgeons. It is the location of posterolateral fontanelle in neonates. There is the importance of the asterion. Now coming to the landmarks in relation to the foramen magnum. This is the foramen magnum, and there is opistheon and basion in relation with it. So the opistheon is the central point at the posterior rim of foramen magnum, whereas the basion is the central point at the anterior rim of foramen magnum. What is the importance of this opistheon and basion? The plane of foramen magnum is the interconnection between these 2 points, that is opistheon and basion. There is what is known as McRae radiographic line, which will be drawn on lateral radiograph or on a mid-sagittal section of CT or MRI of skull that connects the anterior and posterior margins of the foramen magnum. In this picture, you can see the points in relation with foramen magnum, that is the opistheon and then the basion, and the line that is drawn between the two, which is known as the McRae radiographic line, and the importance of which is the tip of odontoid process, that is the lens of the axis. You can see it is about 5 millimeters below this line, and if it is above this line, above the McRae's line, it indicates a congenital or acquired craniocervical junction abnormality, and this abnormality, depending on the severity, it can press on the brainstem structures. So now you know about the importance of the various landmarks in relation with the skull.